All right, so thank you all so much for coming. This is my colloquium for an MSc in computational linguistics, technically in language and communication technologies at the University of Saarland, which is in Germany, where I've been a student for the past 6 years, technically, although remotely for most of it. Topic of the thesis is open source and low resource languages. Here summarized as OSS and LRLs. And we're going to go through and talk about how open source can help LRLs and the like. So starting off with just what I say in the abstract, is just a really brief summary. There's a number of languages in the world. There's around 7,000, probably a bit less than that now. And yet the number of languages which are used online and for real in the sense of digitally is around 30. It's definitely less than 50. There's not a lot of languages that we see on the web. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, especially 4 of you are not native English speakers. So the fact that you're all here and I'm talking English and understand me is actually pretty much a direct result of the fact that English is everywhere. And English is one of a few languages that is just all over the place, the other ones being like Russian, Chinese. And why is this the case? Well, tools are hard to make and they're expensive, and generally it's been a whole lot easier to continue developing in a language which already exists. So we're going to talk about how we take other languages on the web and other languages digitally and what it means to be a low resource language and a high resource language. And specifically, I want to talk about how open source can actually help with making the web and all the digital sphere a more multilingual place. A place where other languages also have a say, and it's not just English and German and Chinese and Russian. Open source is a methodology to use in software development. We're going to go into it in depth. So first we're going to cover like what are low resource languages, then what does digital presence mean, what does it mean to be digitally available, what is open source, and what open source tools exist for low resource languages. Here in this thesis, I also talk about a couple of case studies. So some of them are scholastic case studies, and other ones focus on 2 languages, such as Gaelic and Naskapi. We're going to talk about what these languages are and what resources are available for them. I also talk in depth about a code resource which I developed with the help of some people called Low Resource Languages. It's a repository on GitHub. I'm going to talk about what that means. And we're also going to have just some general discussion, as is normal. As far as the contributions that this thesis sort of gives, as far as I'm aware, it's the first published analysis of FLOSS for LRLs that's kind of large and cohesive. Liling pointed out that there may be other ones that do this on sort of limited basis, possibly on a more global basis. I'm not aware of those yet, except through you, Liling, so I'd love to see more of that. As far as I know, this is the first ecosystem-wide study of FLOSS for LRLs. Also, this is a new description of the only database that's only about open source resources for low resource languages, which is my database on GitHub. We've already described this in a paper, Hugh Patterson and I, in 2015 at one of the LREC workshops called CCurl. But this is an updated version of that. Also, it's the state of the field for Gaelic OSS, which hasn't been done in a couple of years. And also, I did some original field work on Naskapi, which is a really small language spoken in northern Quebec. I went there and talked to some people, had a good time, and learned about that language. And so I present some work on that. As far as I know, this is the only discussion of open source for Naskapi, although there has been some computational work before. I also think this might be the first use of the decentralized web for LRLs that I've heard of. Decentralized web is a new movement trying to get rid of centralized companies as the only stakeholders in charge of service and storage. So I talk about some opportunities for low resource language linguists. This entire discussion is just going to be one long tongue twister for me, and I apologize for that. And I'm looking forward to talking about that as well. Sweet. So here's the general outline of the thesis, also the outline of this talk. Introduction, no surprises there. Low resource languages, what are they? What language resources exist? What is open source software? Let's combine those 3. What open source software is available for LRLs? Let's look at 2 specific languages, Gaelic and Naskapi. and let's look at some best practice recommendations going forward for any researchers, and then we'll have a short discussion and then some future work. I have 35 slides. I talk incredibly fast. I talk even faster when no one else can ask a question easily. If you feel like I should slow down, speak up if you can. And I'll try and make sure that this lasts around 20 to 30 minutes. The other option is I could just talk really slowly, but that would not be cool. So, introduction. Half the world's languages are going to basically become extinct this century. Extinction means there'll be no speakers, no first language speakers, no second language speakers. Various definitions around that. But this was predicted by Krauss in 1992. Really dire prediction, especially dire when you consider that the whole field of linguistics is based around the idea that languages are what we study. And so watching half of all of our possible things to study die is really deplorable and doesn't really happen in other fields. There's no way that half of all nematodes are going to go extinct in the next 100 years, but half the world's languages will. Not to say that new ones won't be invented, but the diversity we have at the moment will change. Less than 5% of these languages have a significant digital presence. It doesn't mean they're not spoken, right? People in Papua New Guinea can talk in a language without having to use the internet. But it does mean that if they want to go online, they're very unlikely to find other Papua New Guineans talking in their language online. The vast majority of the internet as well, like 95% of it, is basically a couple languages. English is everywhere. English is not the only language, but this is part of the problem, right? We have these massive languages which rule everything. Tools are expensive. Let's use open source. I basically covered this in the abstract section. So jumping right in, what are low resource languages? Well, there's a lot of different terms that actually make sense to talk about. I really talk about these at length in the paper, largely because it was sort of a lit review section, but also because I use these terms indiscriminately a lot of the time, and it's important to know what they are. So really briefly, here's just like a basic description of these terms. Again, I go into further length in the paper, and I basically will use that addendum caveat throughout this talk. This is supposed to be me telling a story about how things are, so take what I say here with a grain of salt, because I say it much more eloquently in the written word. Endangered languages are languages which are in danger of not being around anymore, not having their first language speakers. A lot of different definitions around what endangered actually means, but that's basically what it boils down to, right? Example of an endangered language would be Gaelic. 60,000 speakers, 30,000 people fluent, a lot less speakers than there were 100 years ago. Very likely that it's not going to be around much longer. Breton had 100,000, or like 1 million speakers in 1950, now it has 100,000. Really, really swift decline. A dormant language is a language which used to be spoken, now really isn't anymore. Wampanoag is a good example, around 1,000. So it sort of went extinct around 100 years ago. The last first language speaker died, and no one's been speaking it since, until it was revitalized, which is the last term here, which is that some people in the community were like, hey, this language is dormant. We know some people who sort of half speak it, or we have list of words and grammars, so let's revitalize it and let's all start speaking it. Now there's 1,000 speakers of Wampanoag. Another definition for dormant might be that there's no first language speakers, but there are second language speakers. An example would be Manx, where the first language speaker passed away, I believe, in the 60s, but there were still second language speakers who spoke English, but also spoke Manx on the side. And they actually worked together to revitalize their language so that there are now first language speakers again, which is super awesome. Manx is spoken on the Isle of Man. One of my favorite examples of a revitalized language, in particular because my friend Chris was part of that movement. And when UNESCO declared it dead a few years ago, he and a lot of other speakers wrote in letters to the UN saying, it's not dead, we still speak it, which I think is just great. Extinct languages aren't around anymore. Tocharian is extinct. It died in the 9th century. Pretty clear. Historic languages were languages that basically had first language speakers and now don't anymore, but are still in some use. Good example would be Latin, right? I did 5 years of Latin. It's clearly used, but do I go around talking to people in Latin? No. There are people who do that, in the Vatican, but generally it's just a hobby thing. It's actually kind of related to constructed languages. Constructed languages are languages which are made up. Fritz speaks Takipana. I speak Natvi. These are languages which did not exist, did not have, hey Fritz, did not have a history in the sense that there weren't people who like naturally spoke these languages. It was mainly just someone came up with the idea. The most well-known is Klingon, Kuplak, all that stuff. Generally not considered real languages because they don't share some characteristics, such as like a ton of syntactic ambiguity. Also, they don't normally have large amounts of speakers. They're important to mention here because we have to exclude them when we look at the web, because people love translating stuff into Klingon, even if they don't speak Klingon in their day-to-day basis. So that's kind of an example of languages that have various amount of speakers, right? A thriving language is a language that has a lot of speakers. But there's also other definitions which are also useful, other lenses with which to view languages. So one of them would be, say, an official language. What's an official language? It's a language where the government has said, hey, this is the language that we speak here. Super, super useful tool, especially for countries like or groups of countries like the EU, where they basically say, hey, officially, everything that we put out is going to be in French and English. I believe German as well. That's awesome, because now there's a ton of more resources for those languages, and they make sure to have translators available. There's also de facto languages. So a lot of people think that English is the official language of the US. It's not. We don't have one. You can speak any language in the US, and that's just how things are, but everyone kind of sort of knows that you really should speak English. This leads to a lot of really angry people being very confused, especially in the US, and I say that as an American. Where people think, oh, well, if you come to the US, you have to unlearn Spanish and learn English. That's not true. In fact, German was almost a de facto language of the Americas. It was very, very, very popular in many, many states until around World War I. My sister lives in a town in Iowa that's basically Germantown, and they used to have 3 newspapers in German. And then after World War I, everyone's like, hey, let's stop talking German because it's awkward. And now they speak English. But there was no reason officially for them to do that, right? It's just a de facto language. De jure language is the language of law. That's one of the ways you say officially this is what our language is. Not always a de facto language, not always the same as an official language. For instance, in Norway, Sami people have right to be represented in their language, and they can go to the court and talk in their language, even if there's no translator, because it's up to the state to provide a translator for them. It's a language of law. Really, really interesting. Often, again, involves angry people being confused. Majority languages are languages spoken by most of the people. Everyone in Norway basically speaks Norwegian. Minority languages are Sami. Minority of the people in Norway speak Sami, even though the majority, speak Norwegian, but they still have some rights. Minority language is also often used to mean low resource, in the sense that smaller languages, right? So they're all part of this giant Venn diagram where they overlap in many ways. Low, sparse, non-central, under-resourced, all also generally mean the same thing. Like a low-resource language and under-resource languages are languages which do not have the same amount of resources as large-resource languages or high-resource languages or over-resource languages. Resources here means corpora and code. We'll get into that later. Sparse languages is another term meaning a language that really doesn't really have much. Non-central is another term meaning it's not majority, it's not official, it's not high-resourced. Generally, these terms are bandied around by different researchers in different fields who focus on a certain topic and don't really want to agree on talking about the same terms. But they all kind of mean the same thing, so it's not really that big a deal. All it really does is make it harder to Google, in my opinion. Incident is another language term. An incident language is a language where all of a sudden the language becomes very important very fast. A really good example is Haitian. Before the earthquake in Haiti, Haitian Creole was just a language a lot of people spoke. After the earthquake in Haiti, it became very, very clear to a lot of first aid responders and to governments that we need to have resources to talk to people in this language, because they're saying they need an ambulance at this corner, or that they don't have water and we don't understand them. And a term for a language like this, where all of a sudden something happens and now we need to figure out how to deal with it, is incident. You could also use source and target. Those are more used in the machine learning fields, where a source language is where you get information, a target language is where you're applying that information to, or that code to. So for instance, if you want to use machine learning on one language that's a source language and you want to apply it to the target language, you would do that. It's just a nice metaphor. Another language term often used is surprise, a surprise language. Those are mostly used in large competitions run by companies or governmental arms that want to basically encourage work to help out with incident languages. A lot of that is really interestingly motivated. For instance, Nuristani languages would be considered surprise languages a lot of the time, or incident languages for certain use cases, where all of a sudden America has to learn how to speak Balochian to talk to people because they're worried that there's terrorists in central Afghanistan or on the border with Pakistan. I'm going to try and stay politically neutral, but that's really difficult.
Richard, quick question. How are you doing time-wise?
I do not know. It's 11:31. We probably started at 20. Let's go faster. All right. How do you judge vitality? In fact, I have a phone over there. No, I'll do it. It'll be fine. Okay. So how do you judge how vital a language is? Turns out there's a couple people who thought about this before. There's four main things that do this. One is GIDS, G-I-D-S, which is generational. Honestly, everyone refers to it as GIDS, and I don't remember what it stands for right now. But basically, it's Fishman 1991. It has to do with domains of usage. So where do people use it in the church? Thanks, Fritz. In the church, in the home, in education, in politics, and also transmission. Are people giving it to their kids? Fishman was really just, that's all he really cared about. Hey, are parents talking to their kids and other kids learning it and using it? And in what domains are they using it? And that's just the easiest way of finding out how a language is doing and how vital it is. And there's 1 to 8 levels, with 1 being stable, 8 being not good. EGIDS, I should have updated the top there. It's EGIDS, it's the extended GIDS. Done by Lewis 2009. It also takes into account that directionality is important. So is the language growing in domains or lessening in domains? Also has more granularity for each of the different levels. And they also added levels. So 0 would be a super language like English. Super in the sense that it's everywhere. And then 9 and 10 are revitalized and extinct languages, which actually weren't accounted for in the original GIDS. Mostly because he only cared about transmission. But EGIDS is used in Ethnologue, which is a large database of languages to actually say what languages are and like to rate all of them, even ones that normally aren't alive. UNESCO is another metric that came out 2003 or so. They have 9 metrics. They're like transmission, the number of speakers, the amount of speakers in the population in general, what the trend is of the language, what domains it's used. And they have 0 to 5 ratings. The coolest thing is that it'd be kind of interesting to take the 9 metrics in the 0 to 5 ratings and add them all up. So you could say 32 is this language. UNESCO researchers, in their wisdom, which I really think said languages cannot be assessed simply by adding numbers. Don't do it. They actually used bold in that quote. And I really love that because the language endangerment index came out a couple years later and they straight out just, let's put a number on it. And just disagreed and just started making just a number. Hey, let's just look at 4 things: intergenerational transmission, which is what the I in EGID stands for, absolute number of speakers, speaker number trends, and domains of use. And they put numbers on things. Grenoble wrote a really fantastic response, which is that you can't really do that, and it's not really useful because languages aren't countable things, and you're also hurting communities by just giving them a number. I really encourage you to read that response. It's great. So that's how you judge language vitality, and that's kind of what people judge now. Language vitality is a much better term than language endangerment because it actually helps out users. Grenoble also wrote about that. Kornai in 2013, Andros Kornai, Hungarian researcher, came out with this awesome thing of how do you judge digital presence? How do you judge how well a language is doing digitally? And by digital, we mean not just like, are they on tapes, but are they, being used on the web being the main place for things. So he had 4 different categories: thriving, vital, heritage, and still. Pretty clear what those are. Heritage is like historic. And he looked at demographics, prestige, the amount of Wikipedia presence, which is really interesting. He said this is like a necessary, without which not, right? It's a sine qua non for language usage, in the sense that if people are online, they're generally going to start at Wikipedia and start talking in the language of Wikipedia. Really cool finding. I don't think Wikipedia should be relevant, but it kind of is. He also started the Digital Language Support Project, where he and some other researchers who are really awesome are trying to show what the level of, existence is for each language. How much Wikipedia entries, Ethnologue, that sort of stuff. This was a really great metric. A lot of what I talk about is in response to this paper. Gibson extended it a bit. He added emergent and latent, 2 things which can't really be defined easily, except by researchers in the field when they want to actually talk about a language that, say, doesn't have it, but could have it. Immersion is interesting because he says that this is basically, you have people talking about it in private text messages, but you don't know yet. I explicitly explored this 5 years ago when I made a Facebook scraper, which was actually against Facebook's terms of service, which is why I never published that paper. But it's really cool to see someone else talk about that. And we're going to see more of that with more privacy stuff. Soria, who is part of this large EU initiative, also had a really cool paper came out recently as a draft in academia.edu. They want comments, and they have 15 different factors, stuff like connectivity, internet connectivity, and where is it used, how much documentation. And each of those has a scale as well. Hasn't yet been published, non-draft like. Looking forward to that. So that's kind of how you judge digital presence. What are these people looking at? What are language resources? Well, these are language resources. Basically, it's corpora and code. Corpora being examples of the language, words, and code being stuff that plays with the words. So you can have a lot of different types of corpora. You could have written, audio, bilingual corpora, where it's like two languages by side, annotated corpora, where it's really easy for machine parsers to look at it already because it's already been touched by linguists or by code, etc. Video, audio, video stuff. And then you could have code, which is like, language codecs, language identification techniques to be able to see what language a web page is in, for instance, morphological parsers, syntactic parsers, spell checkers, tokenizers who can actually split language up into individual words, lemmatizers who can split out words to the root base, part of speech taggers. And I really wish I could just keep going, but in the interest of time, let's just agree that there's various things in code that do stuff on language and that you can read about them. There's also aggregators who look at all these resources. So CLDR is like the Unicode aggregator. Data Language Project is what LEI was based on. Ethnologue is a giant database of all linguistic stuff. They also are in control of the 639 tags, the ISO tags used around the world to identify languages. Glottolog and Omniglot. Well, Glottolog is a response to Ethnologue. It's an open source version started by a researcher at an MPI in Nijmegen, not Nijmegen, another one. Omniglot is like a dictionary of fonts. There's a lot of really cool big organizations out there that basically try and figure out, hey, what's out there? What do we have? We're going to talk about these more later. And then there's other ways of looking at basically what resources are. So Blark was this whole idea, started in around 98 and then kept going until 2003 or so, of getting researchers together in a room and saying, what do we need for our language? And you have these big Blark maps, which are giant grids, which have like, okay, here's the tokenizers, here's the corpora we need to make these tokenizers work, and these other cool parsers work. Blark's great. It takes a lot of effort to build a Blark map, and I think they haven't got a lot of uptake because of that, and also they're language specific. LREs is a smarter idea, I think, which is basically, hey, we have this huge conference, LREC, every year. Why don't we talk to the people coming to the conference and just have them describe what they have for their language? So now they have a giant database of 4,400 entries worth of stuff. Unfortunately, this is still biased towards the larger languages. So there's 133 low resource languages and only around 400 entries for those languages. They also don't really cite where those things are. They just say this exists and they don't really point to it. So it's really close to being useful for LRLs, but mostly just a glimpse of what language resources are in the field. Who makes language resources? Well, pretty much everyone. Everyone's been making language resources for a long time. There's a really good quote by Hammerstrom where he says, travelers and ideologues and, your mother's uncle's cousin's nephew's niece are all making language resources. Here are the main parties I see. So linguists who are generally academically interested in a language specifically, computational linguists who want to do stuff with code in that language, often NLP practitioners. Language communities often do stuff, and this means people who actually speak the language themselves, who aren't coders or linguists, that just want to have more stuff with their language. That's actually fairly common. Missionaries is super common. They're everywhere. Mainly Mormons and Protestants, evangelicals. Although I think there are some Arabic missionaries who do some things. Muslim, not Arabic, my bad. SIL has a fleet of missionaries they send out to basically every country to translate Bibles into their native language. Generally good people. I really like them. I don't really like the Christian faith, and so I often kind of see it as kind of a really weird like mixture of, hey, they're doing good language research work, but also spreading an ideology that I don't agree with, which we can talk about at length elsewhere. A lot of nonprofits working in this field, particularly from like the US, where people are worried about dying languages. Often these are spurned out by linguists or spun out by linguists or computational linguists. Also, large enterprises do a ton of language resource work. In fact, the main majority. So Google, Nuance, Apple. Obviously, they're doing work. Google Translate is work. This is the stuff that most people use, mostly for the high resource languages, mostly not for low resource languages. And then there's things like DARPA and the militaries, which are really interested in knowing what people are saying and being able to analyze that fast and quick. I actually kind of put enterprise and DARPA together. You know, Microsoft has massive, you know, they have like a $12 million contract right now with ICE. I'm guaranteeing you part of that has to do with database, and part of that database has Spanish language stuff in it. Fun. So all those people have really funded very well. What about open source? What is open source? Why am I mentioning open source at all? Well, open source is kind of this movement that's been going on since around the 80s and 70s with Unix. The idea being, why don't I share all of my code publicly? I can have a license on it, but the thing is that people, if they want to use it, have to use the same license. And that's really interesting, right? The idea sort of started as an altruistic movement. Hey, it's a lot better for the world if I release my work, but also has really interesting business facets. For instance, if I release my work, more people will see it, more people will want to work with me on it. I won't have to do the work that they do, and I get marketing for free. Such that Linux is now one of the most popular, you know, OSs in the world. In fact, Unix is in Apple. It's everywhere. In fact, pretty much every single thing that you're going to use on a day-to-day basis has some open source code in it. Partially because that got out and because it didn't have a price tag. Open source really helps innovation a lot, and also really advantages people who work on it. In the sense that you don't need to have the checkbooks of a large international corporation, and it's not locked away in DARPA. The OSI, which is the Open Source Institute, defines open source as these sort of things. They also have a couple other definitions, but basically you have to have free distribution. The source code has to be publicly available, has to be well marketed, has to allow derivative work so people can change it. You can't discriminate against who uses it. You can't restrict against usage of it. The license has to be distributed with the code, and the code has to be able to be edited by people, and those edits have to be able to be forked back in. All of those things are not givens, and without them, you don't have open source, right? So you can't have all these things and then say, pay me $10. That's not open. You can't have a closed source license. That's not open. There's a lot of licenses which protect the owners, protect the owner's rights, protect the owner's liability, protect the owner's attribution. MIT, Apache, BSD, or like MIT is the main one. GPL is interesting. The GPL license basically says that if you use this open source code, all the work you use it for has to also be open source, which means that if you have one GPL library and a huge stack of libraries, all of a sudden your entire chain has to be open source. And it's kind of a nasty way of saying, be good to everyone else or else you're breaking the law. A lot of people don't like GPL, especially large companies. Creative Commons is cool. It's also used for things outside of code. Then there's lots of funny licenses like the unlicensed. It says this isn't licensed at all. There's the do what the fuck you want license, which I really like, but don't use it because it's really bad for liability. MIT license is great. How do I know what resources and what licenses are used the most? Because there's basically one major winner for where open source in the world is, and it's GitHub. GitHub has tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of code. It has 80 million users. It just got bought by Microsoft for a lot of money. Most of the world's open source is on GitHub. It's not the only place open source is, but it also allows us to have a really good snapshot of what the ecosystem is and what open source is out there. In the same way you would go to the Library of Congress to find out how many books there are, you go to GitHub to find out how much code there is. This is really important to know when you think about open source, because you have to think about, you know, permanence and relevance and code rot and where to store things so that they're not deprecated in 5 years so that your server doesn't go down. Most academics don't think about these things or haven't historically, and they just sort of put their code on a little website with their university, and then it's really hard for people to access it, and it generally doesn't have the license. GitHub really helps there. Someone is chatting to me. How does that work? Whoa. Oh no. Where's my, okay, I shouldn't have clicked on that because my mouse. Let's go back. I'd appreciate it if questions will wait till the end, I guess. Thanks. I'm probably doing iffy on time. Funding is really important when you think about open source because you can't obviously market the open source product. You have to market stuff around the product. Most people don't open source because they're worried about funding. If I open source this, I won't get money for it. Generally, you're not being creative enough, and there's tons of ways to make money off open source. Let's talk about that later. So, given that, what open source is there for low resource languages? Well, I tried to find that out using these 5 different techniques. 5 quick tips. So first I looked at a use case for what you could do, just like this one particular problem. So I looked at mapping linguistic coordinates. That's not the umlaut, it's the diaeresis lily. It's very rare, but I like it. OSS and aggregators, I looked at all the aggregator stuff I could find. I looked at the linked open data cloud. We're going to talk about what that is. And I looked at cross-linguistic projection, which is a really interesting subfield of computational linguistics. And then I looked at my own database, which I also made. So as I point out in this section, if you really wanted to do some small stuff, so for instance, low resource part of speech tagging, you can often find a tool for that. So Garrett and Baldridge wrote a paper, and then they put the tool on GitHub, and you can just go get it. But for larger studies, so for instance, Gone and Ring 2016 talk about how to map linguistic coordinates, basically how to put languages on a map. And they talk about around 100 different resources in that paper. And half of them are open source, and half of them are closed. And the workflows they use mix closed and open resource. So for instance, say you use Google Maps. Yes, it's open access, but it's not open source because we don't know what's under the hood. But then say you use a tool that converts KLZ to KLM files. If that tool is open source, then you have an open source part of your workflow. Well, part of your workflow is open source, even though you're also using Google Maps, which is closed source. And so doing academic research and doing any sort of language research today kind of involves using both closed source and open source and semi-closed resources that are kind of, you know, half here and half there, open access and the like. It was really fun. It's really hard to have a solely open source methodology, and I'm not suggesting anyone do that. Use what's available, obviously. But it was really cool to like follow down the rabbit hole and see what I could do. Looking at the aggregators, most resource aggregators that I talked about earlier don't have code on them, right? Glottolog is basically academic references. It's not code. Or if they have code, they have a paywall. So Clarin's great and Metashare are great, but you have to sign up and be a user, and you have to pay to join. And so as an open source researcher trying to get stuff done, it's kind of locked away from me. And it's not open source because it's behind a paywall. And it's not well marketed. Some things just have no link to the code, right? LRE Map says they're resources, but then don't link to the code behind them. So thanks. Some of them have limited coding resources. The LDC, the Language Data Consortium, suggests 5 different tools to use with their corpora, which is good, but that's 5 tools, and they're really specific to that corpora. Or some resources in the aggregators, some aggregators have like a lot of different stuff, but without good coverage or clarity. The ACL Wiki has a link to different tools, around like 400 tools, but only 30 low resource languages, and most of those resources aren't really useful. And yeah, it's not ideal. It's just not a lot of good coverage, not a good clarity. And in general, what we see in the world is that there's hundreds of resources, not thousands, that are open source, which is indicative of the scope of the issue we're talking about when we talk about how can we make resources public. Linked open data is a semantic web, the whole idea of taking all these aggregators together and being able to access them together, which is great. But if you already looked at those aggregators like I just did, it doesn't really help you much. And also you have to learn Sparkle, which is a really confusing querying language to understand the semantic web. And also the Open Linguistics Working Group, confusingly called OWLG, and the Linked Linguistics Open Data Map are great, but I still don't really understand who's using them. And I've helped publish papers in that field with these people. They're great guys. I love the OLG people, but I'm kind of confused if they're used at all. by low resource people. At the moment, doesn't really help us answer the question of how much is out there. Multilingual projection is a really fascinating concept where basically, let's say you have a parser of Arabic and you want to use it to parse Maltese because it's similar. So you just take the parser and just put it on a Maltese database. It doesn't always work, but you can sort of fine tune things. AGIC came out with a great paper in 2015. If all you have is a bit of the Bible, which is the most common corpora for languages, how can you project onto 100 different languages from that Bible? Fascinating stuff. The lingo matrix from Bender and UW also has a lot of cool projection. The issue with these is that they don't tend to leave traces of how that projection was used on which languages. And so I'm not going to be able to see how to use it on Navajo if it was only used on Dakota. And I have to be a basically computational linguist to understand and use these tools. And they also take a large amount of annotated corpora at the moment, normally. I mean, AGIC's paper is different. NLTK is a really good example of an open source project that's awesome that can be used for a lot of different stuff, which isn't language specific. So it's a natural language toolkit. Fantastic work, really, really popular, taught in a ton of NLP courses, not language specific, but really useful for low resource languages, also useful for high resource languages and for training people. The issue with NLTK is that it's hard to track usage. I don't know how often it's used, and it's hard to track forks, although they do exist as a JavaScript implementation, which is great. And it's really hard to find forks that are used on particular languages, right? So tools that use NLTK, which work on Uzbek-Techo, I have to find them, and that's not useful just by going to the NLK website. Discovery would be something we could work on there as a field. So what I've been doing over the past 3 years is I set up a repository on GitHub, which is basically a database of code. And I said, hey, let's just put all the links to everything I can find in it. So we have 440 links, around 500. 30 specific languages are mentioned in there. We have 20 contributors or so, 160 stars. What's really cool about this is that it's crowdsourced, so anyone can edit it. And it's collaborative in the sense that anyone can edit it. And it's curated in the sense that me and a couple other linguists manage it. And it's easily editable in the sense that you can just edit it. And it's searchable in the sense that you can use Control F and search. And it's very present because it's on GitHub. Thanks, Fritz. And this is a really interesting resource. And looking at the other aggregators, I think this might be the most useful resource on the web right now for finding open source resources for low resource languages, which scares me because I'm just a master's student, but also is kind of cool because I'm just a master's student. So yeah, go take a look at that. I would appreciate it. As I said, I already talked about this in another paper, but this is an updated version of that. And I mentioned a few more things. Really cool stuff. So after looking at those 5 use cases, I try to think, well, what if we look at a specific language and try to find the open source resources for that language? So I looked at 2 languages, Gaelic, spoken in northern Scotland, 60,000 speakers, 30,000 are literate. I lived in Scotland for 5 years, almost never heard a Gaelic speaker. Because it's dying, it's not doing very well. UNESCO says it's definitely endangered. Ethnologue says it's provincial. It's at the 2 level, which isn't so bad, but still kind of, yeah. LEI says it's threatened. Cornai says it's living because you can find stuff online. A lot of stuff you can find online comes from Kevin Scannell's work, where he made this massive parser that found all sorts of languages. It's called On Krubadan. It is a really cool resource, and often the main resource for finding corpora, actually, for low resource languages at the moment. And he works on Irish. And so a lot of his stuff actually also applies to Gaelic. And he's also done stuff on Gaelic. There's a lot of academic research. There's a Bordna Gaelic. I can't pronounce Gaelic at all, by the way. I'm an English speaker and I never learned it. There's also some small groups like Michael Bauer's group and Faklo working on Gaelic higher language technology. Super fun. Generally not a ton of researchers given the small size of the language, even though it's culturally really fascinating. Cornai's website, Digital Language Support, actually is a really good resource for finding out what's available, because they talk about the language packs that are available, that they have a large Wikipedia, that they have a Hunspell, which was made by Kevin Scannell. They have a large Krubadan corpus. 1.5 million words is massive, comparatively. And there's some open source available, which is cool, but there's not much. At the moment, there's no language technology courses for Gaelic and Scottish universities, and we're unlikely to see more growth. And as far as I know, the best resource for finding OSS for Gaelic is my list. And this thesis, which again is great, but also sad. And I wish we could find more. And I wish that open source people work together. Scannell wrote a really good paper about using open source a couple of years ago, like 10 years ago, and how to pool resources. It'd be great to update it and have more people do this. Looking at Naskapi, another language, very small, only 1,000 speakers, spoken in northern Quebec. Most of them are bilingual in English. A lot of them are trilingual and quadrilingual in French and Martiniquais, which is another indigenous language spoken nearby. I went there. It's like a 1,000-kilometer drive and a 300-mile train. And they have an SIL outpost where there's a thing called the Naskapi Development Council, which is staffed by Summer Institute linguists. There were around 4 of them or 6 of them when I was there. And they have some translators from the community. And they're working on developing the language, which is super cool. They've translated the New Testament. They've translated some children's stories. They have a large dictionary that's available online. It's great. UNESCO defines it as vulnerable, which is actually less threatened than Gaelic, partially because they have such an awesome speaking community, in the sense that they all speak it all day to everyone in all domains. Ethnologue puts it lower at educational, it's not provincial, because it's not, because Quebec doesn't have Naskapi as a native language. LEI doesn't have any information on it at all, and Konai just says it's dead because it's not online. Doesn't mean it's dying, just means that it's not online at the moment. They have no language packs, no Hunspell, no primary text, only 2,000 words in the Croupidan corpus. Odin has 1 IGT reference. In my paper, I added another one, so now there's 2. Most of the Naskapi language stuff revolves around Keyman, which enables you to have scripts, and there's a couple websites that tell you how to install the Inuit syllabics, or Inuktitut syllabics, which are used for Naskapi. And they haven't really progressed beyond that level of here's how you write it, right? There's no parsers or anything. There is a dictionary, but it's mostly through SIL, and it's on the webinary, which I wasn't able to access, I think, which I was kind of, I wish that I was, and I wish that everyone was. And literacy seems to be limited to people writing in Roman characters and probably using English and using memes. All the kids on the train I saw were talking, like when I saw their phones, they were in English and spoken. And there's work to be done there. The computers in the school need to be updated with Keyman, and then there needs to be a level of literacy in the school that goes forward from there. They have a new internet cable being laid this year, which means they're going to be a lot more open to stuff happening. I'm really interested to see how this grows as a community and whether or not they can actually enforce literacy on a day-to-day basis. There is some, there are books in the school, but there's no Facebook groups in Naskapi as far as I know. There's no websites written in Naskapi really, except for the train website, which is great, but let's do better. I really wish them the best. And the SAL people are doing God's work there, which is great. So those were 2 example case studies where I looked at what was available. And then I sort of suggest best practices, which is if you're going to choose a license, basically go with MIT. It's the easiest. Everyone else does it. I like it. Scannell says GPL because it forces people to use GPL more. I think that's kind of methodologically ambiguous. I would use MIT. Choose repositories. I would just use GitHub. It's the biggest, and you really want the more people to see it, because the more people see it, the more likely it's going to be used. The more likely it's used, the more likely it gets used. Right? Great. I would also say decentralize it. Right? Put your code everywhere. Put it on GitLab. Put it on your academic server. Put it on your own server. I even suggest putting it on the decentralized web, which is a web that doesn't need to have large corporations in charge of it. GitHub's owned by Microsoft, which is kind of awkward. Might be cool if you just put it on the web and then people can replicate it and share it as they are. That's a huge other discussion, but that's the whole thing. And I'd also just say market your code. Talk about it. It's really important. I make those suggestions, and then I talk about a basic discussion, which is digital presence necessary for low resource languages? It's kind of unclear, right? So Naskapi, they're going to keep talking in their language, and it's doing okay. It's vulnerable, but it's not horribly threatened. Do they need to go online and have web pages? No. But are they doing that in English? Yes. Would it be better if they did that in Naskapi? For Naskapi, yes. For the people, I'm not sure. It's unclear. There are other questions, right? Is free and Libre open source even ethical, right? You're asking people to work for free. It's really unclear. I would say yes, but it's unclear. Is encouraging low resource language people to go online and make massive Wikipedias in their language relevant? I mean, who uses those? Do people actually use it in the communities, or is it just hobbyists working on it? It's unclear, right? Is data privacy a concern for language technologies? For data, yeah, sure. Some people don't want their data on the internet, particularly their languages. But for code, well, you should probably put it online because that's work that might be useful to other people. So there's trade-offs, right? Where you put stuff and how it works. And should we open source? Yeah, definitely open source everything that you can. That's just me talking as someone who's seen the power of open source. My whole career is built on it, and I really like it. And I haven't had any issues with money. I haven't had any issues with being scoped or sniped since using open source, in the sense that like I haven't lost money. And I think it's generally helped me in my research a lot. And I've seen it help other people. I would suggest it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written this thesis. Future work, a lot of cool stuff we could do. I don't really want to go into these in depth. We could synchronize metrics. We could make a database like the LRE map, actually link to the code. We could find metrics of code in LREC and ACL. We could develop more resources with Naskapi and Gaelic. And by we, I mean me, I guess, or anyone who reads this thesis. If anyone wants to collaborate, I'm totally available to that. I would like to split this up and put this into various journals and talk about it, because I think it's an important message that you should use open source, and it's really hard at the moment. Yeah, you can ask more questions than that if you like, but for now, I think that's it. I talked really fast. I hope that was okay. And thank you all for listening. Again, thank you, Prince. Questions? Yep. Dietrich?
I'm saying thank you, but I could also think about a question. So, I'm a bit lost on your future work.
Okay.
So what would be your one single recommendation to the computational linguistics community?
Put all of your code in the ACL wiki and talk about it, and make a GitHub organization for ACL, and enforce every single publisher of a journal article to put their code on GitHub and link to it in their papers. That would be my one recommendation.
Thanks. And then a related question.
Yes.
Suppose you would be an advisor to the US government.
Yes.
What should they change in their research programs on low resource languages?
They should force people to put their code open source, so that any work they do is relevant to the low resource language communities that actually talks in those languages, in the same way that you have to publish your results if you have an NSF grant. Public work should be public.
So I have a related question too, and this, you know, I appreciate that you mentioned these ethical issues and privacy concerns related to data, and I think it's a reasonable stance. Okay to protect your data, but don't protect your code. But there is this dependency between data and code,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what do we do? Do you have any, how can we break that sort of dependency cycle? What can we do about that?
That is a very good question. I said it's unclear, because it is unclear, and every single situation has its own concerns. I think what's more important is that it's that you keep in mind that open source is a methodology and it's not a rigid system. It's better to err towards open. It's a value. Austin Principles of Data just came out. I don't know if you're aware about that. I mentioned in the paper, actually. And it's basically recommendations by linguists for where to store your data and how to store it. And it says err towards openness, you know, but also err towards the rights of the people who say it. The reason this is important in linguistics is a lot of communities don't want their tales to go out there, and they, you know, some people don't even want to talk to other people in their language because they're just tired of, you know, white missionaries coming in and saying, give me your language. They wanted to keep it for themselves. And so it's really important to honor those respects. And so just as you would honor those respects in every single use case where someone says, hey, could you not make that public? Or, hey, this is off the record. You should do the same thing with annotated data. There are probably ways to tease out data from code if necessary, where you could say, put the annotation schema and make that available, and then make the code available, and then say we can't release the data because the words are actually protected by the privacy laws. But the schema isn't, in the same way, you know, like, hey, here's how you would look at IGT or something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
No problem. I can't see the chat. Let's see. How do I see the chat? Clap, clap, clap. Thank you. Thank you for the timekeeping, Liling. Any other questions? I may have gone a bit over time. I apologize.
Yep. Don't worry, I don't think there are any other questions. And nope. Then thanks again, Richard. Nice presentation. Was a very interesting thesis project, very unorthodox, but I think in the end successful. So yeah, well done. Congratulations.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. What do I do now?
Unfortunately, there's no virtual champagne. That's really.
Right.
But so this is why we have forced you to have local attendees as well, so you can now celebrate with the local attendees.
I will do that. I will also celebrate virtually with Julia, Liling, and Fritz. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Good. Then, thanks everybody. Have a nice weekend. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks, Fritz.
Bye.
Signing off. Bye-bye.
Bye.